Good evening. Y'all ready to get through this? All right. This is the chapter I absolutely hate. Let's talk about radio frequencies, the difference between an analog and a digital modulations, how radio frequency transmissions are made, how you measure them, how they behave, and how you can impact those type of transmissions. First, you need to understand what a radio frequency is and what they're important for. Why are they important to understand? Well, you need to be able to troubleshoot them in the case you don't have a wireless network and you're not able to get a signal in one specific area, but you can everywhere else. What's interfering with me? And then also to understand in terms of the terminology for the wireless networks. When we talk about gigahertz, what does hertz mean? When I say modulation, when I say, we'll get into other terms here in a little bit. What is an electromagnetic wave? Well, you have an electric field which gives you your vertical field, and a magnetic field that gives you your horizontal field. Okay, I know I just did them opposite, but you have your horizontal field and you have your vertical field. That's what we call electromagnetic. They go in opposite directions, and then that streamline is the direction in which the electromagnetic wave goes. Now, in every different direction, you can have an electromagnetic wave, and they just they really are perpendicular to each other. All right, they slice through each other at a 90-degree angle. Does that make sense? And they go at least the speed of light, if not faster. The good thing about those waves are that they're continuous and they're cyclical. What does cyclical mean? You have a measurable start and stop. That means they run in cycles. You can pick up the 2 points and measure that certain distance. Okay? Continuous means it does not repeatedly start and stop. It's just continuous. The conversation between Dallas and I would be continuous. You just go straight to Dallas. Okay? Where a cycle would go from here to Adam, just kind of like this. That would be kind of a start and stop, right? Cycles are basically what we call oscillating. Okay? You have your oscillating signal, and then you have your sine wave. Okay? Your oscillating signal, or sine wave, whichever way you want to call it, basically comes up, comes down, and comes back up. So it's basically, if you have a horizontal line, you make an S. You go up over it, come back down, and come back here. The length from point A to point B is what we call a hertz. All right? Here's a sine wave. Up, down, back. That's one cycle. One cycle is a hertz. All right? The distance between how many cycles can come in 1 second is how many cycles it is. Tells you the speed in which. So if you have a megahertz, how many cycles per second is that? Mega? Million. Giga. 1 billion cycles a second. That's pretty quick. Okay? Your wavelength. Now that is from point to point at the top or the peak of the signal. Or the peak of the sine wave. Now you can make it really at any point on the wave, so long as it's the exact same point at the wave. Does that make sense? So here it is. Frequency is the rate in which the cycle occurs or an event occurs, or the number of times that the cycle occurs. A hertz is the cycles per second. So if you have a kilohertz, you have 1,000 hertz per second. Megahertz, million hertz per second. Just remember M&M, right? M&M candy. Giga is billion. And then the wavelength in frequency, you have an inverse relationship. What does that mean? It means the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. Because that means you're making it very, very, very small. Because if you have any of you seen an oscilloscope, an O-scope? Have y'all seen those before? I'll have to ask the science department and see if I can't bring one in next week. I was going to ask them today, but I forgot. So that if we change it, you can see how many of these, we can make it shorter or longer depending on the hertz and the frequency. Okay. Thank you.
Still recording?
Should be. Yep. The lower the frequency, the bigger the waves are. Does that make sense? The higher the frequency, the more waves are in that same amount of space. So there's you just a hertz abbreviation and table chart, which we just talked about. Amplitude. Amplitude is the distance between the peak and the zero line. Okay? Is either how high or how deep the wave is. That is how strong the electromagnetic field is. So the higher it is, the more amps are on there. So would you want it to be a short wave? Yeah. If it's a high wave frequency, you kill yourself, right? High amps. A phase is the relationship between at least two signals that share the same frequency yet have different starting points. So I have two signals that have the same peaks and the same valleys, but are called in phase, which I'll show you here in just a second. The peaks and the valleys do not always match. They're considered out of phase. All right? If they're the complete opposite of each other, the first signal is in phase. The second signal is 180 degrees out of phase. So, if this is my in phase signal, right? In my opposite, where this is down, this is up, this is considered 180 degrees out of phase. Make sense? So electromagnetic spectrum. Here's where the radiation and stuff occurs. Radio waves for buildings, very small, right? Humans, we're about right here. We can only handle so much. Butterflies, they can hear. Needle points are about right here. And as you can tell, by the time you get down to atomic, you can see how much it would screw with the human, right? That's why atom bombs and atomic bombs can actually screw with you pretty bad. It just throws you. I mean, they keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so the frequency gets tighter and tighter and tighter. So you have radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. Gamma rays are the ones that are very dangerous to us. X-rays are about as much as we can tolerate. All right? Any questions?
I heard that a comparison of a CAT scan. One CAT scan is equivalent to like 100 X-rays.
Yes. That's why you don't get them very often. A light license is normally required from the SEC to send it in a specific frequency. It's because they want to know how strong your signal is, where you're sending it. There are certain unlicensed bands which are not going to be interfering, and so the FCC doesn't really care about them because their power limits are not going to affect anything. If you get closer to military bands or government bands, then they get tighter on the restrictions. Your unlicensed national information infrastructure, your UNII band, basically your short range frequencies, your walkie-talkies, those kind of things. Your very low frequencies are VLFs. Those are your maritime ship to shores. Your LFs are going to be your aircraft homing or beacon singles, or those are going to be your TACANs, Vortax. Your medium frequencies are going to be your AM. And then you have high frequencies, would be your CB radios, shortwave radios. Your VHF are going to be your TV stations. Your UHF are going to be your air traffic controls. And your higher end or low end wireless LANs, your cellular telephone, public safety. This is where a lot of your range is right here. UHF. Your super high frequency, that's all wireless. And then EHF, which is extremely high frequency, they have to have that so they can shoot out to outer space, so they don't lose the signal attenuation. Your walkie-talkies will be out here in the 10 kilohertz to 30 kilohertz range. And the reason you have the LF frequency, those are going to be your ILS approaches because they're real close to the airport. 15-mile range, line of sight kind of stuff. Then you get into some of the private classes. You get your ISMs. They have specific ranges they can use for cordless phones, wireless, public branch exchanges. Your UPCSs, those are going to be your public, and then you have your UNIIs. These are where you can have fun with. You're limited to 300 megahertz range. And then you have your millimeter waves. So that's going to be your 5 gigahertz at home. Now let's talk a little bit of fun. In order for a radio wave or microwave to be sent, or any type of wave, it has to be modified to transmit to whatever receiver is going to receive it. We call that modulation or keying. What that does is you're modifying that signal to fit that transmitter. I.e., let's just say I speak English, Rick speaks German. He doesn't know anything about English. If I want to transmit to him, I have to learn German, right? Or he has to learn English. So let's say I learn German. I can now talk to him, so I have keyed myself or modulated myself to be able to speak his language. An electromagnetic wave that has been modified in order to carry the information is called a carrier. So my signal now is called a carrier wave or a carrier signal. Does that make sense? Now I can do that either on an analog signal or I can do it on a digital signal. It doesn't matter. Think about it as being a wave signal. That's all it is. The difference between a digital signal is it's either on or off. An analog signal has the sine waves. Okay, digital signal is basically a box. If it's at 0, it's off. If it's either up or down, it's on. Does it make sense? Analog signal is a continuous one without a break. Amplitude modulation. It changes the amplitude to the highest peak of the carrier wave. The carrier wave that I'm sending to Rick has the highest being a 1, the lowest being a 0. Frequency modulation changes it to the number of waves to represent 1 bit more than the number of waves to represent 0 bit. Okay? Phase modulation, all I do is I change it to be in phase. So if it's a 1, it changes to a 0. That's all it does. Thoroughly confuse you? Yes.
Modulation basically is controlled by whether you're using a 1 or a 0.
Exactly. That's all it is. Just like right here. Here's amplitude modulation. Notice this one's higher than this one. That'll represent a 1. The next one's low, 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 1. Right? I've got a 1 down here, so this one isn't going to represent anything because we're looking for the peaks, right? So my bit value here is going to be a 64 and a 1, so it's really be 65. I'm sending 65 right there. Make sense? Y'all with me? Frequency modulation. If I have 2 of them in that block, it represents 1. So I've increased my frequency in that section. So if I have the sine wave comes up here and then I have a double one, that's going to be 1, 0, 0, 0. Oh, got another one. It makes sense? Y'all see the difference? Phase modulation. Come down, back to 0. When I have a complete one, right? Notice this is 180 out. It's 1. Same, same, same. Oh, now we're 180 out. Then it's 1. Does that make sense? Because I've changed the phase of it. Digital modulation. A digital signal is discrete, meaning that it's either a 1 or it's a 0. All right? It's separate. Why is it easier to understand than analog? Because in digital, think of it as you're looking down a fiber optic cable. If you see a light, it's on, right? If you get it black, it's off. There's not a gray area. So it kind of may have been a 1, like you would with an analog. See, if I'm sending down an analog signal down a copper, if I get down to loss of signal attenuation on the other end and it picks it that there's some signal on there but it can't make it out, it's just going to say, yes, I've got a signal, but I can't make it out, so I can't repeat it on. Okay, I ran that into at the interim semester. When I cut the cable midway, put an amplifier in there, boom, now I got my signals up and everything was working great. If I made it all digital, I wouldn't have had that problem because it would have known that it was on or off, on or off, on or off, right? Digitals require less bandwidth because it's either on or off. Simple. You're not continually having to force extra stuff down. You only have to send. It's counting by timers. So when it receives it, it starts counting. And after it keeps counting at that same rate until it is told to count differently. And then when a light comes on, boom, it counts that. All right, that's all it looks for. Requires less power because you're only transmitting light.
So that's changing from digital to analog?
No, this is all digital. You're not going to have, you'll have less chance for EMI because with light, or you're only sending one signal, very short spurts of signals. You're not sending a continual signal that can be interrupted all the time, right? Error correcting techniques. I'm getting bits and chunks of information. It's easier to correct and auto resend, right? It uses the same modulation techniques as analog, but we have different ways of doing it. We have what we call shift keying. Okay, so ASK or ASK, FSK, PSK. Amplitude shift keying. Instead of a 1 bit and a 0 bit being a carrier signal, the ASK 1 bit has a carrier signal and a 0 has no signal. Like I said, 0, you're not sending anything. Frequency changes the frequency of the carrier signal. So if it was a 0, it sends something, and if it's 1, it's not. The phase. Signal starts and stops because it's a binary signal. So let's talk about it. Amplitude shift key. I'm not sending anything. All of a sudden I send it. Boom. Now I got a 1, right? Isn't that a lot less bandwidth? Because you're not putting anything in here, right? All I'm sending is just blip, blip. That's it. Frequency shift key. Looks very similar, doesn't it? Phase shift. Looks very similar, doesn't it? Now, RF signal strength. You've heard of watts, decibels, right? There are four units to measure it. You have milliwatts, MWs, decibels, milliwatts, dBms, the received signal strength indicator, the RSSI, and then a percentage. So let's talk about these. Milliwatt, what is it? It's voltage, right? It's your current that is being pushed on that wire. Power over Ethernet carries current. The resistance, how long is this cable? How much does my signal have to go through before it disintegrates into nothing? How far is it going to carry it? Electrical power, a watt. A watt is basically a unit of 1 amp of current that follows at 1 volt. That's what a watt is. A milliwatt is just 1,000th of a watt. So just remember, Viper. V-I-P-R. Voltage, current, electrical power, and resistance. All right? Decibels. It's a linear scale. It represents milliwatts, is the reference point. 0. It's a relative scale measured in decibels. How loud is it? So how powerful is this particular wave? Make sense? Because decibels and milliwatts are on 2 different scales, you have to convert them. Okay, the shortcut is known as the 10 and 3 rules. A decrease of 3 decibels yields roughly half the original value, and an increase of 3 decibels yields roughly twice the original value. So here's the rule of thumb. If I lower it by 10 or by 3 decibels, I have half my wattage loss. If I increase it by 3, I've doubled my wattage. If I've lost by 10 decibels, I've lost 90%. If I do by 10, I've gained 1,000%. That's just a rule of thumb. So if I ask you on the final exam, what's the rule of 10 and 3? What are you going to tell me?
3 decibels is.
You're just going to tell me that it tells me how much wattage I'll increase or decrease. Okay? That's all I want to know. I don't want you to be able to do the conversion. I just want you to know what the basic is going to be. Okay? RSSI is a mechanism by which the RF signal strength can be measured in the circuitry of a wireless NIC. All it is just telling you how strong your signal is. You notice you have those 4 bars, just like you have on your cellular phone, you have the 4 bars. We have 4 bars of signal. That's all an RSSI is. Just tells you how strong your signal connection is. Pretty straightforward, right? Why should it not be considered for the RF signal strength? Because it was not it wasn't intended for that purpose. B, each vendor does RSSI differently. And third, the energy levels of your phone or wireless device may not be set or have their representative integer set the same. It may not be programmed the same. So do the bar value really mean anything to you? So now when you see I have 1 bar on my phone, does that really mean you don't have any that you have connectivity? No. How many times you're driving through it says you have 3G and you can't make a call? Or how many times you say you have 1X and you can make a call? It makes no sense, does it? Or you're sitting literally 3 feet from a significant other and they have 4 bars and you have 1X. You can make the call and they can't.
I work for AT&T, so I get those all the time. It says I'm in 3G.
Yep. It's your RSSI programming on that phone. Doesn't make a bit of difference. That's for the troubleshooter. That's really all it's about. The percentage, all it is used to avoid inaccuracies of using RSSI is the basis for RF signal. Percentage represents the RSSI for a particular packet divided by the maximum RSSI value, then multiplied by 100. It's a calculation that you will never use. Okay? Unless you plan on being a wireless expert. Like Dallas back there. Noise. That's what happens when I open my mouth. No laughs. Man. Unwanted interference. That's what my wife says. Okay, signal to noise ratio, or SNR, not Saturday Night Live. Desired signal, undesired noise signal to the average power of the transmission. You have 5 bars, 3 to 4, 2, 1, no bars. Okay. All this is doing is telling you how strong or how many decibels that it can see. That's all it is. How much noise interference do you have? That doesn't mean that your connectivity is gone. How much noise between you and that WAP? Usually by the time you get down here to less than 10 decibels, you're not going to connect anyway, because it's not going to be reliable. I usually don't connect below 2 bars anyway. Radio frequency behavior. Basically, all it does is it tells the signal, or it how do I want to describe this? It's just like a 3-year-old. You take them out to a restaurant. The behavior of that 3-year-old is going to affect how well your dinner is, right? Whether you're embarrassed or whether you have a nice meal. Correct? Same thing. The signal behavior. If it's going well and doesn't have any kinks in it, you're going to have great signal. But once it hits a barrier of any kind, it's going to impact the speed and performance of that signal. So if there's obstacles in the way, it's going to have interference. So your goal is to limit those obstacles in its way. Propagation. Common misconception. RF signal goes out from an antenna in a single signal that takes a direct path to a receiver. Wrong. I can bounce that signal off this wall and go to over into 218, bounce it off a wall and hit the instructor computer in the back of the room. That could be how that signal gets there. Or it could go up and then come back down. There's no direct path. Multiple signals will get to that computer, right? That's why we call it wave propagation, because it propagates from different points to come into one. Just like LTE, you have 3 towers that send the signal into one point, and then you get that extra buffer of open communication and bandwidth. That's why you get that increased bandwidth, because you have 3 bigger lines coming to you rather than one. So some of the different ways you're going to have absorption, reflection, scattering, refraction, and diffraction that we talked about last chapter. All right. A lot of people think this is exactly how it happens. So if you draw me a diagram, I say, draw me a wireless diagram of how things connect. If you draw me something like this and just show me a direct signal to these, I'll say you're incorrect. You draw me a big bubble around here, I'll say you're correct because it's going to be bouncing off all these devices and off all these walls to get to this device. Does it make sense? Materials that absorb things: concrete, wood, asphalt, trees. Reflection, things that will bounce the signal back: walls, buildings, ground, metal, mirrors. Scattering, the limbs on trees, water, rocks, anything that has a sharp, multiple, not a smooth surface, will scatter, hits and reflects. Diamonds are wonderful for that. You've seen the sun come in and it comes out in multiple different colors. That's called scattering. Refraction, the rainbows, that's refraction. How it bends it, that's why they get that concave structure. Diffraction, the RF signal comes in, gets bent underneath the car, and gets pushed back around because it's reflected through the windows, out the windows, and around the vehicle. Attenuation, we talked about that a little bit earlier. It's how long you'll go before the loss of signal. All right. Two phenomenon that can cause it is the free space path loss, which is just natural path loss. It has nothing to do with refraction, absorption, or any of those natures. Or delay spread, which is the difference of the time that multipath signals take to get to the receiver. All right? Those are the two different ways. Let me give you the difference. Free space means you're just too far for the signal to get to you. Delay spread, it keeps bouncing too long before it gets to you. Does it make sense? You're still within the 300 feet, but it keeps bouncing around before it gets to you. Amplification. I'm amplifying the signal. I'm increasing the gain of that signal. That's what I did when I put in those two amplifiers, or the two switches. I strengthened my signal, pushed it down that Cat5 cable. Boom, I achieved my results by amplifying that signal. They could hear it at the next switch. In amplification, delay spread can occur if the copies arrive at the exact same time as the primary signal and the in phase. And that's what we call up fade. So what's the problem? If I amplify the out of phase signal and it gets there at the exact same time as the up fade, it's now got contradicting phases. So it doesn't know what to do. That's why wireless has some issues with amplification. Is there any questions on this chapter? Was that very informative? Kind of a lot of new information for telecommunications, right? A lot of telecommunications type stuff. More telephone-based analog stuff.
Interference, the dB, I always recognize it as being a negative number. So on the cell phone, if you look into it, it's negative, and the higher the number, the worse your signal. Up to 56, no signal at all. And then 50 is good, 80 something's okay, and 100's pretty bad.
Well, each phone, each device has its own limitations. Okay, it depends on the signal. We're talking about the frequency itself, not the phone. You're comparing apples and oranges here. Don't think of it as that way.
Well, I was talking about the signal, the way it
Right. Well,
represents the
right. I don't want you to get confused here. You're talking about the phone, and what you're seeing is the decibel loss on the phone. Okay, that's completely different than the signal itself. The more problems you're having with the signal is going to increase that number that you're talking about to get up to the 256. Okay, so the more problems you have with this, that's what's increasing your number.
that one's indicating loss, and the other one's indicating
the actual problem with the signal issue itself. What you're seeing is, oh, we're having multiple problems with the signal. Now you know that it's more of a signaling issue from the tower to the phone. So it could be a wireless antenna issue on the phone, or wherever this guy or girl is living, that tower may be having issues. Or wherever they may have been. They may have the wrong towers programmed into their phone. It could be a variety of different things. Interferences, exactly. But we're talking about specifically the wireless signal itself has
Decibel level of the actual
Yes.
signal.
the signal itself will lose out, and you won't get that signal on the opposite end. So therefore, they would never have seen the signal to begin with. Does that make sense? They would have been at 0 dB, so they wouldn't even known the signal would have existed. Any other questions? Did I thoroughly confuse everybody? Well, it's better tonight than what it was last night when I went through 3 chapters for a class. Right, Jordan? Cole, were you in that class? Or were you in no, you're in ISA. Jordan, you're in my intro to routing. Kevin, you're in there. Huh? Oh, that's right. You're in advanced routing. All right. No questions?